Hello and welcome to our very first introductory episode to Untangle. I'm your host, Melanie Brandenbeer Fang, and I'll be guiding us through this journey as we're trying to discuss something that's not quite talked about these days, and that is mental health. I am a clinical nurse specialist in mental health and addictions, and I have experienced through my practice that my patients tell me about a multitude of topics. And one of them is that they struggle to recover through the mental health condition, and that is because they experience a lot of stigma and there's a lack of awareness of mental health these days in society, what it leads them to be feeling stereotype, which impacts the way that they recover through the mental health condition. As a result of it, this podcast has been in my mind for the last little while, and you might wonder why. Well, one of the biggest barriers into the resulting of what my patients experienced before is the lack of awareness and the lack of resources out there into talking about mental health within the common populace. And this podcast will try to change that. We'll try to potentially discuss what hasn't been untangled before. So now that we have an understanding of why it's so important to talk about mental health, why don't we run through a few statistics that will reinforce this view? Well, from the World Health Organization, mental health conditions are increasing worldwide, and there have been an increase in 13% of diagnosed mental health conditions since the last decade, dated to 2017. There is also statistics from Australia, and they have shown that mental health conditions are quite common. It is explained that 1 in 2 Australians will experience at least one mental health condition once during their lifetime. Also, other statistics have shown that in society, 1 in 7 Australians will experience depression and anxiety once during their lifetime. And in the workplace, recent surveys have shown that 91% of employees believe that mental health in the workplace is quite important. Yet, 70% of them actually feel supported by their superiors. Now, looking at the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population, when compared to another population, it is established that they are twice as likely to die from suicide and 3 times more psychologically distressed. Individuals from culturally diverse backgrounds have also shown to have a significant health disparity, where they try to avoid engaging with services and often do not seek help from the mental health conditions. LGBTI+ individuals appears to have the highest depression and suicide in Australia. And above it all, suicide continues to remain a public health issue. Well, there's a multitude of reasons to why there is such a rise of the recently diagnosed mental health conditions over the last decade, but we can't discuss all of them into this podcast, so we'll try to include a few that are pretty much relevant to almost all of them. And one of them is stigma. Stigma is essentially recognized as the misconstruction of ideas that people develop and then raise very stereotypical views in someone with a mental health condition. For instance, somebody with psychosis is aggressive, or somebody with depression being unreliable. Statistics have shown that 3 out of 4 individuals with mental health conditions actually experience this, and this is relatively quite alarming. Additionally, we cannot disclose the fact that mental health is actually relatively new, and you see the recency of this has led to a recent understanding of it all. And you see mental health has changed over the last couple of decades. And back in the olden days, as they say it, practices they were acceptable at that time. But when we evaluate it this time, it's quite barbaric. However, there's also not enough resources out there that support the recent changes of mental health in society. And the ones that are actually available actually portray the idea that mental health is stuck in the practices of the old ages. So we arise to a conundrum where individuals with genuine interest into developing a greater understanding of mental health actually end up developing stereotypical views of it all. Also, the other part of the resources as well is that there is far too many. So which ones are the ones that you actually trust? And it takes actually a lot of understanding into healthcare science and actual experience on it to actually differ of a good resource and a bad resource. And this is what this podcast is gonna try to address, is trying to give you a more modern view into mental health in general in society these days. But also we need to highlight the recent changes due to the COVID pandemic out there. And there is this illness has put a lot of strain into individuals out there. It was recently reported that people are experiencing 3 times the amount of psychological distress. And that is due to a multitude of reasons. One of them being losing their jobs, another one being losing a loved one, or 3 being having to experience this horrible illness at itself. There is also an increased awareness of mental conditions over the last couple of years, and there were official resources developed by the Australian Department of Health, which is called the 5th National Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Plan, which established the goals that mental health care should be addressing in these days, and also evaluated the problems that we're still experiencing in society as well. But without delving into the topic itself, because it will be discussed in an actual episode of the podcast, we need to also establish a set of rules into listening in. And one of them is that I am linked to healthcare organizations out there that prevent me from giving you health advice, in the sense of this podcast should be utilized as a way to increase your knowledge and then as a potential tool to enable you to talk to your local health practitioner or trusted mental health professional about a particular topic of this. But I also have to say that I am linked to the Australian Health Practitioner Regulations Agency and the Nurse and Midwifery Board of Australia to provide to you with the appropriate code of conduct, professional standards, and a code of ethics. Additionally, because this is a mental health podcast, we need to also highlight the idea that I'm also linked to the Australian College of Mental Health Nurses Standards of Practice. And we need to also understand that ultimately though, everything that I tell you during this podcast should not be taken as healthcare advice. So with the legalities out of the way, why don't we get to talk about what's important? And that is, this podcast is essentially gonna create a greater understanding for you in relation to mental health. And also, we're gonna try to release this second weekly. If there is any particular topic you would like to talk about, or you would like to potentially discuss or learn, please do not be afraid to reach out. And we can talk about what actually really matters to you. And in that, we can create a better understanding of this. I would like to thank you for tuning in with us and listening to me talk about was actually one of the most difficult topics to discuss out there. And it's all for good reason, because we want to encourage people to talk about what actually really matters for some individuals, and that is the importance of mental health. Additionally, we want to also potentially create a nice environment for everybody where individuals with living conditions of mental health are gonna be able to reach the full potential of themselves. And you see, above it all, I want to break down those barriers that we encounter these days with society, that mental health is taboo and that mental health shouldn't be talked about. And in truth, reality, that's not how it actually is. Mental health is not as difficult as you think you might be. It's just the intricacies and this plasticity of it all is what makes it subjective for everybody. And you see, that is what makes it so special, because not every person with a mental health condition is the same. They're all different, and that's what makes it fascinating, because it truly dwells into the humanity of themselves. But why don't we talk about stigma in the following episode? That'll be released shortly. So tune in, relax, and listen along. And again, if you'd like to reach out, please do not hesitate.